Hello folks and welcome back to my channel. In this video I will show you some tips and tricks on how to set up your controls for DCS World in an efficient way. So, see you in a bit. And we are back. Now, before we get started in game, let me say a thing or two about the general struggle that comes with DCS World control setup. As already mentioned in some previous videos in my DCS World beginner's guide, setting up all the controls, remembering them and managing them is probably one of the hardest parts for any DCS World beginners, simply because DCS World offers so many, and I would say hundreds of different key binding options, not only for the specific modules, but also key bindings that apply generally in the game, and they are not tied to a specific module. Being it changing the camera views, circling through the labels, how the kneeboard navigation works, and so on and so on. So I think that making this kind of guide is also a totally a necessary addition to my beginner's guide. Now I will quickly mention here again what you will definitely need is a HOTAS system, meaning a hands-on throttle and stick. You need a joystick and something you can adjust the thrust of your module with, like something like this. And what is also very helpful, as you can see here, some kind of rudder pedals under your table, not only to control the rudder surface of your module, but also to control the nose wheel steering, which is also very important for the ground taxiing with many modules. Now, what else I have here and what I can totally recommend, especially for anyone who is planning to fly in virtual reality, it's a gamepad like this small gaming keyboard. This one is a Razer model. I think Logitech also has those. Using something like this just really makes sense because of the ergonomic design. Remember, when you have a VR headset strapped to your face, you cannot really see your controls. So the ergonomic design of these small gaming keyboards make it much easier to remember where every button is, where your controls are, even if you're virtually blind. And it's just more easier to reach this with your left hand instead of the keyboard in the middle. And of course, you will also when you're playing in VR, occasionally need your mouse, especially with the full fidelity aircraft, where you have to click a lots of buttons and switches in the cockpit, but also for your external camera views. Now that we clarified these basic things, there is one more point to mention here. The one and only DCS World control setup guide, of course, doesn't exist, because every gaming setup you guys might have at home, all of these are a little bit different, and everyone has different preferences, I would say. So I will try to keep this as general as possible, but at the end of the day, with different control setups and different preferences, of course, you will at some point figure out what is your own favorite kind of control setup, and you might watch this video and think like that what I'm doing here doesn't make any sense. So with that said, we will see in game. Alright, back in the cockpit of our SU-25T, I want to start with the most basic controls that you will have to be familiar with before you even start flying. For that we will press our escape key, go here in the menu to adjust controls, and I would like to start here in this drop down menu. In the very upper here you see the UI layer. These are basically controls that apply everywhere in the simulator, and it doesn't matter what kind of module you are flying at the moment. Some of these are also mentioned in the in-game tutorials. Some are, I would say, important, like the active pause here. Sometimes you might need that, especially in training missions. I didn't bind it to any specific key. We have here the restart mission. Here it's also by default left shift and R. You won't need that often, so there's not really a reason to bind that to your HOTAS. Now important for VR players, the Resender VR headset. You need that quite often. I bound it to a button on my flight stick, and the same is here the VR zoom, of course. Other than that, here in the UI layer, you have here the multiplayer chat and so on. I personally didn't really have time yet to play DCS World in multiplayer, so I also didn't need these. So yeah, what you need to remember from here, the active pause, restart mission, and the VR zoom, and resender your VR headset. Now what is also very important, and now we will start applying these for a specific module. We choose here our SU25T. The drop down menu next to it, if you scroll completely down, you have here a view. And view is basically where you adjust everything that has to do with your camera views, especially switching between external view, cockpit view, F10 map, and following the weapons that you deployed. Now it's also here you see it's a lot of different controls, different key bindings. It's difficult to understand at first what is important and what is not. So let me give you here like what in my opinion matters. Definitely the F1, like usually all of these different views are somehow bound to the F keys, which especially when playing in VR is a little bit inconvenient to use. The cockpit view is important, which would usually be the F1 key. Also important the F10 map, the tactical map of the area where you are operating in at the moment. Then also here the aircraft view that basically lets you cycle through all of the aircraft that are in your current scenario up in the air. We will go through this more detailed later on. And of course, very important, of course, when you fire a weapon, you want to follow it and see if it hits the target or if it was a miss. So these four different camera views, the cockpit view, the map view, the aircraft view, and the weapon release view here, I usually bind them through up, down, left, and right. So they are very easy to reach and easy to remember. Now what is also important, and again you cannot find this in here, when you are in the outside view of your module, you want to be able to look around, and that is and change the view. So that is most easily done with the mouse. For that you have to go to the drop down menu again, and it is obviously an axis command, since the normal mouse movement is an axis. And you will find it here, and you will have to assign these axis commands here for viewing around. Now that I showed you that, let's see what that means for us in game. We are currently obviously in the cockpit view. If I change that now to the F10 map view by pushing the right key in my case here, it gives us the tactical map of the area. At the moment I choose an airfield in the Mariana Islands, so usually you can see here the different airports and so on. Yeah, it's just the tactical map. So let's go back to our cockpit view by pressing up. Now we also have the aircraft view, which I assigned to the left button. When we press that, it will give us the possibility to cycle through all of the aircraft that are currently in our airspace. For example, this is now ourselves. If we keep pressing the aircraft view button, we will see here an IL-76, an AN-26B somewhere, another IL-76, another Su-25. Cycle through all of that and we are back at our own aircraft. Now, when we are already in that view, almost forgot what I usually assign to my down key. At the moment we cannot use that because we didn't deploy any weapons. Usually the weapon following view I assign to my down key, and we will have a look at that later when we deploy a weapon. Now, what it is also important, and it applies anywhere, you can see at the moment our aircraft here, they are labeled with the red text. Now, usually I always also bind this label cycling somewhere. I don't know at the moment what is the default key binding for it, something a little complicated. I keep it simple. I usually bind it through my Y key on my smaller gamepad here, so we can easily cycle through these labels. Now, what is also important, in some modules the Su-25 doesn't have it, but some of the more expensive full fidelity modules certainly have that. When you start a mission or you're placed in the cockpit, in the air or on the ground, that the pilot is visible here in the cockpit, and that might be disturbing because sometimes the arms or the knees or whatever body parts of the pilot are covering important buttons and whole panels in your cockpit. So you always want to be able to turn on and off the pilot in your cockpit very easily. I usually bind it to my X key, which is also easy to reach on my small gaming keyboard. Now, what is also important when it comes to general controls, the knee board. Now, with those of you that are not familiar with what a knee board is, a knee board is usually this instruction papers that also real life pilots have strapped to their left knee and upper leg. You cannot see it here at the moment because, as I said already, the Su-25 doesn't really have a pilot figure showing in the cockpit. But the knee board usually contains vital information about the area where you are currently flying at. It gives you all kinds of info about the surroundings, about the airfields, the airfield approach charts, the runway numbers, and so on and so on. So you also want to be able to access the knee board easily. I usually have it bound to my space key, and if I keep that pushed, I can cycle through the pages with my right hand by pushing the number 4 and number 6 key on my numpad of the keyboard. Like you can see it here, for example. Now, what we also have, what generally applies to all of the modules, is of course the radio menu in your upper right corner of the screen. You usually activate it. I don't know what is generally the pre-programmed button for it. You would always want to bind the radio menu to a button on your HOTAS. Also, it's usually assigned with the push to talk button that would be on the real life throttle in full fidelity aircraft. So yeah, here you can open the radio communications menu that you need to communicate with the ground crew, the ATC, your wingman, and so on and so on. You need to be able to turn that off and on quickly and without interfering with your flying inputs. At last, I also need to mention all the controls regarding your pilot's head movement. Now, for example, you can see me here looking around all the time. In that case, I don't do that with any kind of buttons or axis that I bound. I use a head tracking device called TrackIR. Now, I highly recommend you to also get something like this, but if you just got started with DCS World and you don't have one of those yet, you also need to have some kind of possibility to move your pilot's head around, which is especially important in full fidelity modules. You need to be able to look down at your consoles and click your buttons and so on. You will also find these controls under your view section here, and it's the same with every module. Usually these are bound to some of the numpad keys, but mostly you would use, and so did I in the very beginning until I got the head tracker. Usually these are bound to the so-called POV switch, and usually every also a cheaper joystick or HOTAS has something like a POV switch that you usually move around with your thumb. Now, another thing at this point, what you definitely need is to assign an axis for your zoom. Like if you are here, for example, now we want to be able to zoom into and zoom out of the view that we have at the moment. It works a little bit different in VR. The VR zoom is usually not controlled by an axis. But if you are playing normally or you have a head tracker, you need to bind a zoom axis, which you find again here under the controls. It is an axis command. You can see me here now, the zoom view. It's the last option here. You would usually also bind that to a rotary of your HOTAS. We are now at the end of the video. I think I covered all the very basic key bindings that you will need in the beginning of DCS World. As I said, you will need this with every module. You will need this also if you didn't even start flying yet. If you are familiar with those, they will make your life way easier. And it is important that you somehow keep those these basic key bindings that I showed you now somehow separated. For example, in how I did it with my different input devices, that they are not interfering with your flight controls, and you can use them in the same way with every module and you remember them easily. So I hope this was helpful. In the next video I will focus on the very specific controls and key bindings that you will need to master the SU-25T. So thank you for watching and see you next time.